Well, welcome, and thank you to our panelists for joining this discussion on the changing conversation, communication in a time of rapid social evolution. We really appreciate you being here to share your experience and expertise. This panel came about when we realized that there's a lot of talk about the events of last year. We're questioning our assumptions about the ways our society works in such areas as COVID-19, political unrest, education reform, social justice, and so much more. We're seeing that it's more important than ever to open up to different points of view and different perspectives. Yet we're also seeing people struggling to connect. It's hard to know whether this time has brought us closer together or created more division. So we're interested to learn what it's like to be on the front line, so to speak, of changing conversations, helping people to have productive discussions in the classroom, in community organizations, with friends and families, when so many topics can be difficult to navigate. We'd like to hear about your own experience and the ways in which you're facilitating challenging conversations. So before we begin the questions, I'd like to introduce the panel. To my left is Alicia Jones-McLeod, is the Executive Director of Challenging Racism, an organization whose focus is to empower and inspire people to disrupt racism, one compassionate conversation at a time. Previously, she led Ellicott City Partnership, and she also founded the Maryland Black Chamber of Commerce, which continues to raise the profile of Black-owned business as well. Next to her, Professor Joshua Clark Davis, Associate Professor in the Division of Legal, Ethical, and Historical Studies in the Yale Gordon College of Arts and Sciences and Director of BA in History program at the University of Baltimore. Josh teaches and researches broadly in 20th century United States history with a focus on social movements, policing, capitalism, urban history, and African American history. He's an author, editor, and contributor to multiple media outlets, and his work has been highlighted in New York Times, CNN, Slate, and PBS NewsHour. And next to Josh, Ting Jiang is Associate Professor in the Department of Accounting, Finance, and Economics in the Merrick School of Business and Associate Director of the Jacob France Institute, also here at the University of Baltimore. Her research interests include entrepreneurship, aging, human capital, workforce development, and digitization. Her research has been quoted in popular media such as Forbes, Time, and Bloomberg Businessweek, and she is a published author of multiple peer-reviewed books and many academic journal articles. And finally, our panelist happens to be on the far left, not necessarily in terms of our conversation, but C. Alan Lyles is a professor in the College of Public Affairs, both the School of Health and Human Services and the School of Public and International Affairs here at the University of Baltimore. He is also a senior fellow in UVault's Hofberger Center for Professional Ethics and a senior research associate in the Schaefer Center for Public Policy. His professional interests focus on pharmaceutical economics and health policy, particularly on policies and practices to improve access to high-cost, innovative medicines. He's published and lectured extensively in the United States and abroad, and he has extensive experience in health service delivery and healthcare administration. We appreciate very much having this opportunity to listen and learn from each of you. I'll be posing a few questions to the group and then directing some individually to you based on my knowledge of your experience. So feel free to contribute to any of the questions that interest you. I will start with a broad question for you to think about, which is what are some of the challenges you see to effective communication, especially in the current climate? But let me just leave that one hanging there for a moment and ask you some specific questions. Alicia, in your work facilitating challenging conversations, what are some of the ideas that you share to help people communicate more effectively?
Thank you for that question. And thank you to the panelists. This is a great panel. I'm really proud to be a part of it. Thank you. But to the question, one of the things that I think people are challenged with is listening. More than half of the conversation is about you understanding the message that's being given, being compassionate and understanding that you can ask questions, you can interject, you can have an exchange of dialogue, but it's about being at the bottom line, being empathetic to the message and understanding that you need to listen to understand what's actually being said. I also want to say that one of the things that I've noticed in having a lot of these dialogues with people that are not necessarily on the same page as I am, where I'm trying to gain their support or partnership, is that there's a lot more said by the pauses than there are by the words. So when people give you a message, listening to how they deliver it, watching their body language, those are all really important portions of understanding the full message and not just trying to get your next point.
Sure. Tell me, could you tell us a little bit about who's in the audience? Who are you actually interacting with in challenging racism?
Well, before I got to Challenging Racism, they were really an organization that was based in helping people that are white-skinned understand how racism, how they have been a part of a systemic racist society. Since coming there, I'm just going to share that I am a woman of color. I identify as a Black woman, and therefore I'm really interested in how women that look like me, men that look like me, people of color engage in that conversation. So I've been bringing more people of color into the conversation because it's fantastic to talk about race or to have difficult conversations. It is challenging to have them with people that only look like you. The hard part is having them with people that don't look like you, that don't see the world the same way. So bringing those conversations together has now become what I'm thinking of the calling of this organization, is that bringing the cross-cultural conversations and cross-ethnic and cross-racial conversations to a place where people feel safe to have dialogue and to exchange ideas.
Oh, thank you. Josh, as a scholar of urban history and social movements, what are your thoughts on how this time of societal change relates to the past, and how do you integrate the history that's happening every day into your classroom discussion?
Thanks for that question. It's a big question. I think it's not always easy teaching history as very dramatic current events are happening all around you. It's been rewarding to teach history, I would say, the last few years in particular, just because there's been no shortage of events and controversies that really develop in the larger context of U.S. history. Even though there's a temptation among some people to think, oh, this is unprecedented, this is uncharted territory. I think the challenge has been, for me as a historian, is really to keep students thinking about the past as deeply relevant to the present, not just as kind of an antiquarian trip down memory lane, but to see that the past, if we look at it carefully, really does shed light on what we're going through now. I think what's also been important the last few years is to kind of nudge students away from this idea that things like the civil rights movement or other big struggles for justice and equality are things that happened somewhere else at some other time. I'm all for treating and regarding people who fought in the civil rights struggle as heroes, for example. And so one thing I've been really fortunate to be able to do is to bring elders from the movement, people who served in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, other movement groups, and bring them to campus and have discussions where they're interacting with students. And it really makes a big impact on students. I think part of the impact there is to say these are living human beings, breathing. There are people you can still talk to. They're not just on grainy black and white film footage from the 50s and 60s. And I think what's been so great about it also is that those guest speakers are very eager to speak to young people, speak with them, not just to them, and to speak about what's going on today. And to, again, kind of get students to think, okay, maybe this is not something that's strictly in the past, these struggles for justice and equality. Maybe I have more responsibility or more opportunity to take part in these struggles than I might think just based on initial review. And so that's kind of been the challenge and the reward of teaching history, I think, the way I'm teaching it, especially the last few years.
Great, super. Well, Ting, you are conducting discussions involving the workforce and our economy at a very interesting time for both. What kinds of challenges are you seeing for our students, and have you changed the way you address these topics in the classroom?
Thank you for the question. There's a lot to talk about at this moment, actually. First of all, yeah, I did have some articles on work from home, as well as another article published earlier this year on online proctoring for our online teaching. So what do we learn? First of all, for the work from home environment right now in the COVID, and there is students facing all kinds of challenges in terms of, for example, financial challenges, right? A lot of people are unemployed. I did hear students tell me stories they lost a job, all kinds of things. So first thing I did is I started to adopt all my courses a free textbook, and all the lab material I adopted using Sakai. So all the randomized tests, so everything's free for them. I do receive a lot of emails from my students, appreciate that, particularly in the pandemic. The second thing is a lot of my courses, no matter it's synchronized or asynchronized, I do say, okay, because we work kind of online environment, so it's very important that you guys are all adults, right? I trust you. So it's more important you self-control, self-paced. So like some student asked me, said, oh, okay, I need to go travel, or I have my medical treatment for my family. Can I take the exam early? No problem. I even said very beginning, okay, if you have any needs, just let me know, self-paced. I trust you can guide yourself. And if you need help, I'm always there. That was particularly working well for the asynchronized, sessions. And of course, from my working from home paper, I know it's not only good for the big business from all kinds of perspective costs, but also more important from the worker perspective. What they feel good about is a control. People feel good about control. People feel good about when they have choice. So they would rather sacrifice pay for the privilege to work from home. So similarly, I believe students feel the same way. If they feel they have choice, they have options. As what I only care is how they learn, whether they learn or not, and whether they can apply the knowledge in the real life or not. So, how they learn, what time they submit homework, as long as it doesn't affect the learning, I care less about it. So that's another thing I learned from work from home. You need to adapt. We have a lot of students who have full-time job, a lot of working mothers. So, give them flexibility. That's really helpful. I like what Alicia and actually Josh also mentioned, that the equity issue. One thing I see from work from home question is that, not everybody are able to work from home, right? There's industry differences, occupation differences. There's some kind of racial differences. More importantly, there's gender differences. Me and myself as a working mother, last 1.5 years, I'm kind of homeschooling my child while working. I know how hard they take a toll on mothers. So I know a similar story from my students. So therefore, give them choice and flexibility, and be understanding and listening to them. And so, try to meet their needs, and that's really helpful. The last thing I want to emphasize, I feel at this moment, communication with students is really important. Feel you're always there. Yeah, I check my email very frequently, so I think that helped.
Yeah, I hear the word trust come up a lot in your conversation that apply to students as well as to employees trying to deal with this return to work place issues.
Yeah, exactly. One of the article we published with several colleagues around the campus actually on online proctoring, we basically illustrate the point that online proctoring itself is good to enforce academic integrity. But on the other hand, we got to be careful sometimes because what we find in the article, the anxiety from students could affect the performance. So yeah, so in that case, for the work from home world, a lot of employers do not necessarily trust employees. So there is employers surveillance, and actually we are doing a new paper on surveillance from management perspective. We try to see what we can give implications to employers, how to adapt to the work from home culture, make employees feel good and does not necessarily sacrifice productivity.
Well, Alan, your dedication to public service clearly informs your career. Would you speak about the value of public service to you and your students, especially in a time when people are struggling to connect?
Well, I'd like to embed that response in a larger context, Kurt, and that is that would incorporate some of the things my colleagues on the panel have said, whether it's confronting racism, making sure that there's an understanding that although this seems like a unique period in time and this time is different, there are certain thematic aspects that are recurrent. 1968 is when I graduated from high school, and it was in Baltimore, about 4 blocks from here. And I'm sure you'll recall there were riots, and that was the year of assassinations. And many of the heroes that Joshua alluded to were very active at that time. So I want to bring a sense of how we got to where we are, and that it seems that these days division, isolation, and the loss of a sense of community at the development of tribal identities is costing us as a society, that we need to look past what's on the surface, that true diversity is deeper than that. And so I say, if you look at me and you had to write an essay on me, what would you say? I have 5 degrees. And then I just leave that there for a moment. I say, however, I've also lived at times the Baltimore City Housing Project, struggled in school, had a single mom. So when I talk about public service, it's in the context of being a beneficiary of the public health system, being a beneficiary of the loans and scholarships that made this possible, being a beneficiary of the teacher who, after several years of the assessments to my mom, Alan has a nice smile, but he's a bit slow. A teacher took me aside and mentored me for 2 years. That in public service, we see the best of us, but we can't see that, I think, sometimes unless we have seen somebody else do that. We don't have to be the beneficiary. We could be the beginning of that. So what I aim to do is to model for my students what I would hope for them to assimilate as their own behaviors in their personal and professional lives. So if we're teaching health policy, I encourage them, this is an assignment, but write that letter to your congressman or representative. Be active, stay informed. Don't just be skeptical. Here's a way in which you can use tools to understand what is misinformation, what is manipulative information. I hope that I have touched on your question.
I ask to all of you, and I'll start with you, Alicia, just think about this, but how do you encourage people to contribute to discussions? Do you have strategies that you use to create an atmosphere that feels welcoming and inclusive and safe?
Well, in challenging racism, I want to say what we do is we have guidelines. So the guidelines are very important to the conversation. So we go over guidelines that we feel as though will be key to that particular conversation. A lot of times we are going into conversations where people know each other. So we'll go into a workplace or a school, and they have some kind of something in common where they're all coming to this one place together. And therefore, the guidelines are more acceptable and people will challenge them. If, we ask for people, we say, are there any that you don't agree with? Are there any that you can't abide by today? So we give them, somebody mentioned choice. Like, I think choice is really important. Having people feel an ownership over the decisions allows them to engage more freely. So I think that it's very important to let people in on the topic, in on the rules and what you expect of them, so that they can shape that and mold that to something that they can buy into.
I know, Josh, in class, you try to draw people in the conversation, even when they're tough issues. How do you go about doing that?
I mean, I think as a teacher, as a professor, for me, one thing that's really important is to try to convey to the students early on that with most things, there's no single right answer. Certainly in history, I mean, I'm not teaching math. I'm teaching the story of human beings, and life is complicated, and opening up students to the possibility that we might be able to have a 20-minute, 30-minute discussion on a single question where students offer 5, 6, 7 explanations of an issue, and they should feel comfortable bringing in these different explanations. I think what's also important for me as a teacher, obviously, as a professor, they're expecting me to quote unquote know a lot and to have a certain expertise. At the same time, I think it's to our advantage to really help students understand we're not perfect, we're not omniscient, we don't know the answers to everything. One of the things we're working on in history is helping students develop skills in research and writing and critical thinking, kind of teaching them to fish, so to speak, so they can also find some of their own answers, and also floating the idea that we might even be learning from each other, that as professor, I'm not immune from learning from them, and not only am I not immune from it, but I might want to do it. And so I think all those things are very important to get people to open up a little bit and move away from the idea if they say something that's wrong and potentially embarrassing or overshadowed by the right answer that someone else brings up.
Ting, how about you? Any strategies that you have for engaging, particularly now that we're not physically, in the classroom?
Yeah, Josh started to mention that he's not teaching math. I'm actually teaching quants, okay? So, but I want to say it's actually, I think it's also very interesting in terms of the discussion. One important part of this is that you bring in the fresh topics. I feel I'm very lucky to teach economics because every day open newspaper or just watch the news, everything's related to economics. Everything you can talk about, particularly last 1.5 years, actually last 2 years, from election to the pandemic, students have all kinds of topics to talk about. So they're very excited. So one of my assignments asked everybody to submit a short assignment on using the economic knowledge they learn to apply to their real life. So no matter whether they're talking about externality right now with vaccination, right? They're all talking about supply, demand, and they use price of gouging was used a lot previously, right? Because in the pandemic, all kinds of demand and supply shift. And all talking about health policy, and the course actually starts with the command versus market system. You can see that's a debate. Everybody has a point of view, particularly students from international background. They're very interested in this kind of debate. Whether it's market or command. And in the pandemic, it's a different situation. There's a mix of market and demand. What works, what is not working. And so one way is that, as I mentioned, I do emphasize, I don't, my course normally had multiple assessment. Exam only take a relatively small portion, but how they apply the knowledge to write assignment, and I'll also encourage right now, video presentation, because it's easier, it's asynchronized in a sense, right? So I say you can be as creative as you want. Some students really have very creative video, really enjoy that. They put all kinds of their own entrepreneurial business or their own interviews, put them all together. They have all kinds of talents, so I really enjoy watching those. So I do award them with creativity credits for anything surprising me. I say, surprise me, impress me. Okay, you can get in the sky's the limit. You can get as many credit, the bonus credit. That's what I call it. And so the hot topics, all kinds of variety of ways assessment. And of course, I told them since the beginning of the semester, you're welcome to catch the errors I make. You're welcome to challenge me. So actually, you're not only will not getting penalized. Instead, you'll get bonus credits. So I encourage them to debate with me. So I think in my class, relatively speaking, I do welcome a lot of those discussions. I think the debates are very interesting. That helps.
Alan, I want to ask you something a little narrower, but
Sure.
take it wherever you want to go. But you're educating the next generation of healthcare professional managers and policymakers in a time when that industry is facing unprecedented challenges. So what are some of the ideas you'd like your students to consider and benefit from as they pursue careers in other areas?
Thank you. Kurt, one of my passions in life that supports the work that I'm doing teaching and what I had done professionally for about 15 years in administrative roles in the healthcare industry is quantitative materials, because it seems that everyone will have a position. Public health and increasingly healthcare is the intersection of medical science and politics. So encouraging early on the identification of vetted, reliable, objective information, AKA data, but also the context and understanding what inferences can be drawn, but where the limitations of that might be, so that when you engage, it's not the intensity of your passion, but it's the power of your arguments that can assist you. Part of what I work on is to assist in the development of mental schema where there will be an understanding of the models that influence. Economics is one, political economy, but also the forces of history that led to so many things that are artifacts, but they are the healthcare system that we have now with all of its flaws and all of its shortcomings. It has potential. So what are the pressure points for change? Where could you be that change? I encourage them at the beginning in our work today, throughout the semester. We're going to have difficult conversations, but we begin and we end with mutual respect. And in those difficult conversations, we're having them because that's what you will encounter or you may be encountering at work. So if we think, for example, of a greater than and a less than sign, where the two ends are touching each other in a point. On the one side, we have those who work in the health sector. On the other side, we have those who require care in the health sector. And then we go through a list of, well, what are the attributes of the people on one side? And what are the attributes of those on the other? And we realize that it has every type of diversity represented. And yet, as managers, and subsequently as senior executives, their responsibility and our responsibility is to assure at that point of intersection, when someone is in an exam room, that they have consistently stellar care with respect, regardless of what the combination of factors are on the provider side and on the patient side.
Do you find it difficult to get people thinking in that way? Because that's an interesting way of approaching where we are in healthcare, at least.
It is interesting, and I'm sensitive to just telling war stories, but most things that I talk about, I can ground it in incidents and events that have happened in my professional experiences. And I could discuss why did that happen, where might this be going, and where are their externalities? The larger political context, regulatory environment, the class that you sat in on, Kurt, with the Maryland Insurance Administration Commissioner, I aim to enrich our classes so they can hear directly from and interact with those who are the decision makers on matters like that, to make it come alive. I use current events, news articles on a regular basis with the argument that when your courses are over and you're a graduate, your textbook is going to be this. How do you use it to stay current, to develop insights? How do you find your voice and then exercise that voice? So not in the sense of impressing with scholarship, but sharing, here's how you can use communication, writing, to accomplish having a larger megaphone and reach broader audiences. And then ask the question, how do you reach those who would be otherwise, for your message, unreachable?
And Ting, I know you are nurturing a new generation of entrepreneurs in our community. What are your thoughts on the current climate for entrepreneurship, and what are some of the ways that you're encouraging people to connect to this climate and work on entrepreneurial ventures?
Yeah, from my earlier, I believe published in April, that article on work from home and small business, we do find from theoretically as well as empirically, we find small business actually benefit from work from home. If you benefit from small business, you can imagine that will benefit more for larger businesses because they have a better infrastructure for technology. And so we see in this kind of work from home wave, right? We were technologically ready long time ago, but a lot of cases are hesitant to adopt this platform. So this is a challenge as well as an opportunity. So it's a lot of new business come out. Even though we're familiar with all kinds of apps come out every day, right? And we have Merit School has one entrepreneurship center. I talk with some students there. They have all kinds of ideas, very interesting. From selling their own self-made teas online, to making an app. To make the community together, to like a bike rental business, all kinds of very interesting. So that's very great to interact with students. From take advantage of the work from home platform, and also realize there's kind of generational change to some extent. Not necessarily generation. They always say more of a period change, right? Time change. So people actually really wanted to have more of a more adaptable, more flexibility, more control, more work-life balance. So that is the market potential there, right? So that means opportunities. And on the other hand, is from the manager perspective, because when we talk about entrepreneurship, we cannot avoid the management perspective, right? So therefore, there's surveillance part, as we are kind of right now trying to investigate into what we can find out, what we can give implications to managers, particularly maybe small business in a sense, because they have more challenge whether to gain enough trust and why they really short on the technology infrastructure and security as well when they handle this.
So Josh, as a public historian, and you're working with many organizations in the community, how do those experiences inform your approach to teaching and topics you address in the classroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, public history is a term, ironically, most of the public doesn't really use, but kind of simply defined, it's all the discussion and study and learning of history that goes on outside the classroom, from museums to walking tours to, now it's just virtually unlimited, the amount of historical material in documentaries. There's quite a lot of good stuff on YouTube. There's quite a lot of good stuff even on Netflix, on Hulu, if you know how to look for it. I think as a public historian, the way it really connects with teaching at the University of Baltimore is that we do really have a very strong mission working with lifelong learners. And I think that the idea of public history, the idea that citizens not only can, but should learn about history in their own time, and that they don't need necessarily a classroom, they don't need necessarily a professor. Of course, those things can really help. But I think that's one thing I really want to instill in students, is that they can seek out self-education of a sort, that it's important that there are community institutions, whether it's the Baltimore City Historical Society, that I work with some on their board, or Enoch Pratt, another institution I'm working with, they do a lot of this work. I think what's interesting to me, though, is like connecting back to what Ting and Alan are doing, is we really, really have to prioritize information literacy and data literacy with our students right now in this moment where there's never been a greater overabundance of information that is available to people in a matter of seconds. The problem isn't not enough good information right now. The problem is too much bad information, misinformation, even disinformation, intentionally weaponized falsehoods. And it happens in history. It happens very clearly in the medical realm, in the business realm. And I think we're all trying to work with students to say, you're going to have to keep learning and teaching yourself after our courses, after you finish your work here. And it's part of being a professional, it's part of being a good citizen, and it's part of being responsible to other people, part of the community.
Kind of flows into the point that I wanted to raise with you, Alicia, as a mentor who has the ability to help others move forward. What hopes do you have for those with whom you interact?
Well, I will answer that question, I promise. I just wanted to make a point with what you just said. I want to give you a little bit of pushback in what is the biggest issue right now. I think it's echo chambers. I think we have all fallen into a place where we don't get any other points of view, and therefore we disbelieve them. And being very realistic about where we are with education, there are a lot of great places for curated information, which is what all of you are providing, right? You're providing a curated perspective to what the world is and how to interpret that. But when we're not privy to those kind of conversations, we fall into a place where, I don't know about your Facebook feed or Instagram feed, or TikTok is a great example. You fall into one place and you can never get out. You're like, I am in this particular TikTok area, and for me to cross over to see something else is very challenging. So did you hear about the Bama sorority girl issue? So there was this sorority at Bama State, Bama University, I'm not quite sure. But what happened is there were a group of young women that were all posting about like their outfits and their pledging and that whole thing, the rush week. And it was only visible to people that looked like them. So it automatically eliminated a large portion of the population from that conversation, which was heavily debated about, is this a place, who are these people that are in this conversation? So when we stop having conversation with people that don't think differently from us, when we stop inviting them to the conversation or looking at how we can engage with people that are different than us outside of social media, outside of media in general, how do you do it in real life? And teach people those kind of tools, I think we get to a place where we can actually have a conversation, because people are missing skills to talk to people that don't think like they do. So that was just my little bit of pushback. Thank you for allowing me to share that.
So let me, before you get to my question though, because that's really intriguing, but as a matter of strategy though, if you were dealing with me, I have a difficult time watching Fox News. Breaking out of my MSNBC and
but what about Adam Carolla?
Yeah.
Like, there are people that are on a different side of the debate than you are,
right,
that are not Fox News.
Right.
Like, Fox News would be like me talking to somebody in the KKK. Like, I don't need to go, it's that much of an extreme from where I am.
Right, but would you encourage that?
So watching something that is completely on the extreme, I think it can be a little too uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think you have to move in degrees. I don't think you can automatically wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going to learn about this whole different way of life. Like, you have to move in portions and steps,
Okay,
just like we do all over the place.
That makes me feel better.
I may come back to you in a year and see if you're watching Fox News shit. Just to say.
So my question to you had to do with being a mentor.
Yes.
And kind of what your goals would be for those whom you are mentoring?
One specific challenge that I try to ask people is really, like I just mentioned with the echo chambers.
Yeah.
Get knowledge that is not self-knowledge. Learn about people, learn about things that are not necessarily in your wheelhouse or that you have a background in, so that you can expand the way that you can lead in a community. Because leadership is not about you taking, you saying, I'm the president of this company. It's really about people's trusting you. And if you don't show interest in other people, it is really difficult for people to trust you.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a basic. But also, like I mentioned in the beginning, listening. And where it is that I expect people to engage going forward is making real connections with real people in real time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the number one thing that I ask people to do. Have you met someone today? Have you talked to someone today in your walk of life, whether it was when you got coffee in a class, whatever you're doing, that may have been different than you today? And that's a challenge that I try to take up every day.
Right.
But it's something that I feel as though is really important. And having people get to connect with people and be comfortable with people in general in real life.
I'd like to ask you all, this has been a very challenging year and a half. I mean, we always have new challenges, but particularly in this health pandemic environment, have you learned any new lessons about yourself that either inform your work or inform your perspective on life?
I'll go first if you want. I feel like I'm right here. Yes, I have learned a ton of new lessons because during COVID, there was really nothing to do besides be introspective. So I was really forced into a place to think about how can I be better at being a human in the world. And I have been, I'll tell you all, if you don't have this blessing, I'll share it with you. I have the blessing of having a daughter that's just like me at 19, 20. I don't know if you remember what you were like at 19 or 20, but I guarantee you said no to everything your parents asked you. So it gives me an opportunity to
I'm just happy the internet wasn't around when I was 19 or 20.
You know how wrong you would be? I mean, everything I say to her, she says, I could just look that up. And I'm like, but really having the ability to be able to look and say, I may be wrong about that in the middle of a statement. Mm-hmm. That's something that I realized I did not do before. And it didn't allow me to backtrack as easily when I would say something that I wanted to take back. So I'm not the authority on most things, especially to my 20-year-old daughter, which is very clear. So learning that has opened up a whole new world of communication for me, just to be able to say, this is what I think, this is what I've heard, this is my lived experience. However, I'd be open to what you have to say, and I may be wrong about what I'm stating here as fact.
Mm-hmm. Good. Any?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, so I'm a white person, a white man who talks a lot and teaches a lot. We talk a lot about racism in my classes, and it's always been important, but of course it's continuing to be important just to recognize how I fit into that as someone who doesn't personally experience racism, but as someone who also thinks it's absolutely critical that people like me really get down to brass tacks, so to speak, to start grappling with this very troubling and still very much with us legacy of racism in our country. And it's, that's a very, unfortunately, controversial view to a lot of people still in this country, where the idea that if we have honest, open discussions about slavery, Jim Crow, even, all kinds of systematic inequalities that are still built into our life, whether we want to admit it or not. There's a lot of people in this country right now who, will go to school board meetings and demand that slavery be removed from school curriculum. So I've been aware of that impulse for a while, but I think what I'm also becoming, and I very much disagree with that, but I think what I've also become a bit more aware of these days is that, there's a school of thought, I think, in teaching history among some people, oh, you could never teach too much about slavery or about racism, racial oppression. I think what's been increasingly apparent to me is that, especially as a white person, but not only as a white person, racial trauma is something that is very complicated to teach, and it's very important for me to be sensitive to students who have personally experienced that in terms of just, the photos I show, certain images. Like, we still need to find ways to talk about some of the worst things that have happened in this country, but it's not just operating under the principle of absolute free speech in my class where let's just, kind of put these images up on the board as though they won't affect people differently. That's been something I have been trying to become more aware of, I think, more recently.
Clearly, in the last year and a half, the issue of racism and discrimination against the Asian Americans has been heightened. And I just wonder whether this period has in some way affected you differently than prior to COVID.
Thank you for kindly asking that. I also received some emails from colleagues asking me how that went. Luckily, for my personal experience, was not really that bad, and partially is our campus. The students are very understanding. That's no problem, and colleagues are very understanding. So, and most of the time, I'm actually home, so I do not have much exposure on that. But seeing the news, it was concerning, particularly certain terms like Kung flu, right? Those kinds really irritating. That's the racial part. So I'm glad we talk quite a bit about racial and equity here. And also from the pandemic, Asians typically perceived as very silent, right? Model minority, on the other hand, silent minority. They're almost invisible in a sense, right? But I think in this pandemic, I see there's all kinds of Asian organizations I was not aware of. Yeah. And as you asked a very interesting question on, what you learn, I think from every of us, every perspective. For me, like Asian organizations, I know there are some I was involved in, but I did not know there are so many different perspectives. So that is great. I feel kind of Asians are suddenly aroused somehow in this country, waking up. Okay, we need to defend our own, our own rights. So that's something new to me. And Asians typically be perceived as harmless to anybody, but they become the victim for all sorts of reasons. That's unfortunate. Yeah. Okay.
Ellen, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. So maybe this is coming in a different direction. I've been accused of that in the past. When I was 43, I was diagnosed with a substantial tumor inside my spine. I had major neurosurgery. It's quite sobering, the informed consent that you have to sign and what they say their first risk of the surgery is. So 13 years, I had follow-up MRI, ultimately discharged. Something will do you in, but not this. At 71, I'm starting to see that there is a limited amount of time to do whatever it is that I'm on this earth to do that's important. And what could that be? I'm not going to win the Nobel Prize. I have no ambitions administratively. Financially, not that either. And I'm starting to realize and to become more open about who I am. And it's not a coming out story, although that's fine. I was always letting my work speak for itself. But I found that when I could say more about what my journey has been, that I have had individual students and others come up to me and say, that helped me, because I know it's possible. And so I've tried to look for venues and write or talk or just simply be authentic. Not so much that in the classroom is too much information, but to be authentic. For example, when I was living with my aunt before my mother could take me, and I was at the housing projects. It was Perkins, right here in East Baltimore. It was a difficult time for me. I was a scrawny little Caucasian kid. And there was a man probably in his 30s across the courtyard who was occasionally there. And then occasionally, I think it was the justice system. But at one point he saw what was going on. And he said to people, leave him alone. That was my angel. So I say to people, when I think of my angel, it isn't people who look like me. I've had it for some time, and it's a gauge of what I think of an area. I have a red hat, and it has white block letters on it. And it says, make racism wrong again. And if I feel like I'm going to be uncomfortable in an area wearing that, it's almost sensory information to me about the level of change that still needs to occur. Thank you.
All these challenges that we've talked about in terms of communications and this era, are you optimistic about where we're headed in the future?
Of course. It would be really difficult to
And
do
why?
it if not.
And why?
I will say the fact that you are authentic and you are able to be authentic and your true self to connect with people is why I'm optimistic. Because no one is, like, we're all on a journey. We're all able to connect with one another. So I'm gonna tell you one more story, a little story. Okay, so I have a puppy. She's adorable. She's like this big. Her name is Cleopatra. She's like that big. I take her out places all the time. And people that I would never have ordinarily had a conversation with will talk to me about my puppy. And they'll ask me like all kinds of stuff. They'll be like, well, do you have kids? How do your kids like they'll get into my life. And it's just, we just needed that one connection point at the end of my leash for them to open up and not see me as a threat or other than or different. And then I can be authentic. And I can say, oh, thank you for asking about my puppy. Let's talk about dogs, right? But it gives us that place of connection. That's why I'm optimistic.
Okay.
Because my dog allows me to meet all kinds of people in the world. But so does my life.
All right. Mr. Historian, how about you?
Yeah. I'd say I'm cautiously hopeful. I think what's really been just eye-opening is not even the term, but the last year and a half with this pandemic, it's just really testing us in terms of how, as a society, are we going to define what our responsibilities and debts are to each other in just the most fundamental way. We haven't really been tested in this country like that probably since World War II or the Depression. And the results have really not been pretty. I mean, with over 600,000 deaths, obviously, and much, much more damage. But I think what I've been a bit more cautiously hopeful about the last few months is seeing that gradually, maybe too slowly, but gradually we have leaders and institutions, I think even in our university system on the state level, but really going up to city, state, federal, where we have leaders increasingly who are saying our responsibility to each other to live and let live and help each other live and not just live, but thrive. Like that is kind of the foundation of community and of like the common good. And increasingly leaders who are saying, I need to prioritize that. We need to prioritize that, even if it means it's unpopular, even if it means this may be something that is a point of attack for political opponents. And there's a lot of people who are still needing to do more in that direction, but I think slowly it's happening, and that's part of why I am cautiously hopeful about things in this country in the context of the pandemic. Yeah.
Ting, how about you? Optimism, pessimism?
I would not say, I think I'm mixed actually. On the positive side, I do see, I mean, first of all, the pandemic showed us how vulnerable we all are and how closely knit the whole world is. And, that's one vulnerability side. And on the other hand, I do see in the pandemic, particularly as scholars who probably feel the same way, a lot of the academic resources used to be very, closed little community. Now it opens up. A lot of data set opens up. So suddenly you feel explosion of all kind of knowledge transfer, which is great. I like that part. I like the whole world can access all the resources. That's awesome. That I feel hopeful. But I feel quite concerned in terms of actually part of the issue mentioned earlier. I feel this is explosion of information age, explosion of information, great. But I feel we might need some filter. I feel those information could be misleading to some extent, depends on how we need some guidance for the quality of information. That's what I'm concerned about.
Professor Wiles?
Thank you, Kurt. Optimism is a choice, and that's a choice I strive to make every day because we're here. If I look at my father, who died functionally illiterate, hadn't finished second grade, my mother, who had dropped out of middle school and worked in a cotton mill in the South, and got a GED when I was in college, and then went to Morgan and got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, College Park, and she got a master's in library science and a PhD. Single woman, we didn't have resources, but at the price of an effort. The major obscenity in her home was easy. If you said something was easy, she knew it was wrong. So I learned not to say easy, but what I have seen is at the price of an effort, so much can be achieved. However, I might stop short if I require that it be achieved by a certain date and in a certain way. So I remember when you were in high school, Kurt, and golly, I didn't like you. You were the quarterback who cleaned our clock every year on the major rivalry football game. You might remember this. Yet again, we lost to City College. If you think about sports, whether it's wrestling, football, until the whistle blows, it's not over. And so I'm hopeful that what I take away and what I'm able to share with my students is the arc of an experience, if not the emotive content, that there will be setbacks, and they can be major. There will be things that occur that you are ashamed of having done or failed at or quit. But if you persist, I think long-term optimism is rewarded.
Well, I want to thank you all very much. This is really uplifting for me, which makes me feel optimistic about the way things are going, that we can meet the challenges presented today, the communications issues, a variety of concerns, and do it with a real sense that things are going to get better in the long run, by and by, as they say, that things will get better. So I do appreciate it, and I'll find out whether there's any other issues to be touched upon. If not, I think our panel is concluded with our thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Great.